Sir, step away from the vehicle.
I just purchased it. The paperwork's right here.
Yeah? And I'm the governor. Step away from the car.
I'm a United States federal judge. You can verify that.
That's fake. You con artists are getting bold.
You're making a serious mistake.
Here's something most people don't know about Lamborghini dealerships. They don't let you touch the key fob until the ink is dry on everything. Not the financing, not the delivery checklists, not the vehicle release verification log that gets signed in triplicate and filed with the regional office. Everything. Only then do they hand you the key to a $280,000 SUV and let you walk it into the garage bay yourself. Judge James Blanc knew this. He'd just spent 4 hours inside that dealership doing exactly that, signing, initialing, verifying, with the patience of a man who had spent decades watching people underestimate the power of paperwork. So, when the key fob linked the Lamborghini Urus to life and the driver's side door swung open with that particular hydraulic whisper that only six-figure cars make, James wasn't nervous. He wasn't hurried. He was just a man getting in his car. Then, Officer Shawn walked in. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." James paused, looked at the officer the way you look at someone who's just said something that doesn't fit the situation, not with anger, with genuine confusion. He closed the door carefully, told the officer, calmly, that he had just purchased the vehicle, lifted the leather document folder that contained every piece of paperwork with his name on it. The officer looked at the folder the way you look at something that's about to become inconvenient for your narrative. "Yeah, and I'm the governor. Step away from the car." James reached for his federal judicial ID, produced it slowly, deliberately, the way you produce identification when you know the camera is watching and you need your body language to be on record. He identified himself. United States federal judge. Offered to let the officer verify it through any available channel. The officer barely glanced at it. "That's fake. You con artists are getting bold." And then, without a call to dispatch, without a request for the sales manager, without a single attempt at verification, Officer Shawn grabbed James Blanc's arm and walked him to the hood of a $280,000 car that James Blanc owned, and put his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked. And somewhere in the corner of that garage, on a camera mounted 9 feet up on a steel beam, a timestamp was already running. That timestamp is the reason you're watching this video today. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you would understand why the system wanted this story to stay quiet. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell.
Let me tell you what this story is actually about. It's not about a cop who made a mistake. Mistakes have a particular texture. They're hesitant, they self-correct, they leave room for doubt. What Officer Shawn did in that garage had no hesitation in it. He walked in with a conclusion already written and spent the next 11 minutes trying to make the facts fit. This is a true story about a man who spent 33 years building the most precise, documented, legally unassailable version of himself, because he understood from the jump that being a black man in America meant that someone somewhere was eventually going to look at you and decide that what they see is more real than what you've built. And this is the story about what happens when that someone picks the absolute wrong person to test that theory on. Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. Officer Shawn didn't just arrest a federal judge. In doing so, he handed that federal judge something that judges almost never get: standing. Personal standing. The kind where you're not interpreting the law from behind a bench. You're the plaintiff. And when a federal judge becomes the plaintiff in a civil rights case, the discovery process looks very different than it does for the rest of us. Every email, every personnel file, every body cam gap, every dispatch log, all of it becomes evidence. Stay with this, because the impossible discovery at the center of this true story didn't come from a whistleblower, a leaked document, or a brave paralegal working late on a Friday. It was sitting in a dealership filing cabinet the entire time, filed under a tab marked Vehicle Releases, Current Month. It was always going to end this way. Officer Shawn just didn't know it yet.
James Blanc grew up in Riverside, California,
in a neighborhood where the relationship between residents and law enforcement was what you diplomatically call complicated, and what everyone who actually lived there would call something considerably less diplomatic. He was not a prodigy in the storybook sense. He didn't get a full scholarship out of nowhere. He worked, graded papers as a teaching assistant to pay for law school, drove a 1997 Civic with a cracked dashboard until he was 34. He clerked for a federal judge who told him in his first week, not unkindly but directly, that he would need to be twice as prepared, twice as calm, and twice as documented as anyone else in the room if he wanted the room to take him seriously. James took that advice and turned it into architecture. By the time he was appointed to the federal bench, he had tried or appealed 140 cases. He had a reputation among both prosecutors and defense attorneys for the same thing. He read everything, forgot nothing, and his courtroom had a specific quality of silence that people described as loaded, like the air before lightning. For 11 years before his appointment, he worked as a public defender, right there, in that same city. He had stood in holding cells and police lobbies and intake rooms, watching what happened to men who were handcuffed in public spaces and told their identification was fake. He knew what that looked like when there was no camera. He knew what it looked like when there was no judge. He knew what it looked like when the man in the cuffs didn't have 33 years of documentation behind him. He never forgot it. Now, Officer Shawn Casper, 31 years old, 4 years on the force. His personnel file, which we'll come back to, shows 3 prior complaints. Not 3 sustained findings, 3 complaints. The difference matters enormously in police disciplinary systems because complaints without sustained findings don't follow you the same way. They accumulate quietly, filed under tabs no one opens unless someone with subpoena power asks for them. Shawn was not, by any measure, the worst officer on that department. That's the thing about institutional bias that makes it so durable. It doesn't require monsters. It requires people who have learned, through 1,000 small affirmations, that certain calls follow certain patterns, and certain people fit certain profiles, and that the paperwork will back you up as long as you write it correctly. He had written a lot of paperwork correctly. The dealership itself, Premier Motory, a luxury import dealership on the west side, had its own texture worth noting. High-end clientele, private bay deliveries, the kind of place where a security guard presence is part of the aesthetic, a signal to the cars that they're safe, not to the customers that they're watched. Officer Shawn wasn't working an assigned post there. He was on patrol. He saw a black man in a garage bay next to a $250,000 car and made a calculation that took him approximately 4 seconds. That calculation had a 33-year error in it. Here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean the kind of interesting where you're watching someone dismantle their own career in real time and they don't know it yet because they think the story ends with them writing the report. Officer Shawn walked James Blanc out of that garage bay in handcuffs, sat him in the back of his patrol unit, wrote the incident report on his in-car terminal, and then, and this is the part where you have to appreciate the particular confidence of a man who has never been seriously questioned, he listed the reason for detention as suspicious activity, possible vehicle theft, subject unable to produce verifiable identification. Unable to produce verifiable identification. James Blanc had shown him a federal judicial ID with a holographic seal, a photograph, a court district designation, and a direct verification number printed on the back that connects to the Office of Court Administration's public directory. The ID you can look up on a government website in 40 seconds with a smartphone. Shawn didn't look it up. In fact, his Bodycam footage, which we'll discuss, shows that from the moment he entered the garage to the moment the cuffs were on, he made 0 attempts to contact dispatch for a name verification, 0 attempts to contact the dealership's floor manager, who was at that moment approximately 60 feet away behind a glass wall reviewing James' delivery checklist. Speaking of the floor manager, his name is Kenneth Ragsdale. He's been with Premier Motory for 9 years. He knows that garage the way a surgeon knows an OR. He would later tell Internal Affairs, in a recorded interview, that he had no prior knowledge of the customer being present in the bay at the time of the incident. No prior knowledge.
of a man he had just spent 4 hours processing paperwork with, of a man whose name appeared on 6 documents bearing his own countersignature, of a man whose verification photo he had personally entered into the dealership's system 47 minutes before the cuffs went on, as part of the standard vehicle release verification log. Let me say that again slower, because this is where the paper trail starts to glow. 47 minutes before Officer Shawn walked into that garage, Kenneth Ragsdale had entered James Blanc's photograph, government ID number, and customer verification code into a time-stamped digital log, the same log required by every Lamborghini certified dealership in North America before a vehicle can leave the premises. It is a liability document. It protects the dealership against fraud claims. It is, almost perfectly, an anti-theft record. Kenneth Ragsdale told Internal Affairs he had no prior knowledge of James' presence, but his employee ID number and digital signature were on a document proving he had verified James' identity less than an hour before the arrest. That contradiction wasn't found by a private investigator. It wasn't uncovered through a leaked source or an anonymous tip. It was found by a federal judge who had the legal map and knew exactly where to look.
This is a true story. And in true stories, the impossible discovery is almost never cinematic. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic music cue. It doesn't get revealed in a conference room with everyone present. It usually surfaces the way most important things surface, quietly, in a filing system, found by someone who already suspected what they were going to find and just needed the paper to confirm it. James Blanc was released from Officer Shawn's patrol unit after 38 minutes. A supervising sergeant, Ernest Wallace, arrived on scene after dispatch finally ran James's name through the federal judiciary directory, and the result came back in a way that made everyone in that garage very still, very quiet, and very interested in their shoes. James didn't raise his voice. He asked one question. Who do I speak with about obtaining a copy of the garage bay camera footage? That was it. That was the whole sentence, and everyone who heard it understood immediately, but the conversation had fundamentally changed shape. James went home. He did not call a press conference. He did not post anything. He called one person, his former clerk, now a civil rights attorney named Michael Burke, and told him what happened with the precision of a man who had been mentally filing everything for 38 minutes. Michael Burke filed a preservation demand with the dealership and the police department within 2 hours. Preservation demands are beautiful documents if you know what you're doing. They legally obligate the recipient to retain all records, communications, logs, and footage related to a specified incident. Destroy anything after receiving one, and you've just added evidence tampering to your problems. Premier Motori's legal team complied. They had to, which is how Michael Burke obtained a full copy of the vehicle release verification log, which is how he found Kenneth Ragsdale's employee ID and digital signature, timestamped at 1:31 p.m., exactly 47 minutes before Officer Shawn's Bodycam activated at 2:18 p.m. And this is the impossible discovery. It wasn't just that the log proved James owned the car, the log proved that Kenneth Ragsdale knew James owned the car before the arrest happened, and then told Internal Affairs investigators that he had no prior knowledge of James's presence. That statement, made to investigators in a recorded interview, is not a misremembering. It's not ambiguous. It is a documented, time-stamped lie told to officials investigating a civil rights complaint. That's obstruction. Federal obstruction specifically, because the complaint was filed with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which means Ragsdale lied to federal investigators. When Michael Burke walked into court with that log, the dealership's attorney went quiet in a way that's different from thinking quietly. It's the quiet of someone doing math and not liking the answer. Officer Shawn's report had said James was unable to produce verifiable identification. The Bodycam footage, which had a convenient 6-minute gap during the actual handcuffing moment, still captured audio, and in that audio, clear enough to be transcribed, James says, "I'm a United States federal judge. You can verify that." Unable to produce verifiable identification. The report was a lie. The witness was a lie, and both lies were now sitting next to a piece of paper that had been filed in alphabetical order in a cabinet at a car dealership, waiting. The system assumed this would disappear.
It had disappeared before with other people in other garages with less documentation. It picked the wrong man.
Let me be precise about what happened next, because vague accountability is not accountability. It's a press release. Officer Shawn Casper was suspended without pay pending internal affairs review within 72 hours of the DOJ Civil Rights Division opening its investigation. That review, which had access to the Bodycam audio, the dispatch log showing 0 verification attempts, and the 3 prior complaints in his file, 2 of which involved black male detainees who reported having valid identification dismissed as fraudulent, resulted in a finding of sustained misconduct on 3 counts: unlawful detention, falsification of an official report, and abuse of authority. He was terminated, not resigned. Terminated. The distinction matters because resignation preserves certain benefits and complicates future legal exposure. Termination does not. His union filed a grievance. The grievance was reviewed. It was denied. Bro arrested a sitting federal judge and wrote in a report that the man couldn't produce ID. The union fought that. They lost. Kenneth Rajdale was charged with obstruction, specifically making materially false statements to federal investigators in connection with a civil rights inquiry. He accepted a plea agreement, 2 years probation, mandatory restitution, and permanent termination from Premier Matori. The dealership, in a statement that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and remarkably careful about admitting liability, announced a comprehensive review of security protocols and customer experience standards. Translation: their attorneys had seen the vehicle release verification log and advised them firmly to settle everything before discovery opened any further. The settlement, the amount of which is under seal, consisted with federal judicial ethics guidelines, also included a provision that Premier Matori's parent company implement mandatory bias training and third-party civil rights audits across all North American locations for a period of 5 years. Not as a PR gesture, as a court-ordered structural requirement with compliance monitoring. Now, here's the irony that is so specific to Officer Shawn's particular flavor of arrogance that it almost qualifies as poetic. His entire reasoning for dismissing James's federal judicial ID was that it looked fake, that the holographic seal was too perfect, that no one who actually had credentials like that would need to carry them. Officer Shawn Casper's termination paperwork, which is now a public record, lists in the summary of findings a direct quote from his own Bodycam audio dismissing the ID. That quote appears on line 4 of a document generated by the same judicial administrative system that issued James Blanc's ID. The header on Shawn's termination paperwork reads, U.S. District Court Administrative Office Personnel Action Record. The thing he said was fake processed the paperwork that ended his career. Sergeant Ernest Wallace, who arrived on scene and failed to immediately release James despite having the tools to verify his identity in minutes, received a formal reprimand in mandatory retraining. His name is in the public record. It stays there. The department issued a statement acknowledging the incident represented a failure of protocol. They did not use the words racial bias. The DOJ Civil Rights Division's written findings used those words on page 3, paragraph 2. That document is public. It will not disappear. James Blanc returned to the bench 11 days after the arrest. Not with fanfare, not with a press appearance. He walked into his courtroom on a Tuesday morning, set his files on the desk, and called the first case. The court reporter, a woman named Mirabelle Andrews, who had worked in that courtroom for 6 years, said later that his energy that morning was different. Not subdued, not performatively composed, just present. Like a man who had gone somewhere and come back and knew the difference. He would say, in the only public statement he made about the incident, delivered 3 months later at a bar association luncheon without notes, that the arrest had not broken his faith in the legal system. It had confirmed something he had understood since his years as a public defender, but had never had occasion to know from the inside. He said, "The documentation was there. The truth was on record before anyone thought to look for it. The question is always whether the right person is positioned to retrieve it, and whether they have the standing to make it matter." He paused for a moment before the next part. Most people don't have that standing. That's the actual problem. My case is not the story. It's the illustration. That sentence landed in a room of lawyers and judges and law professors, and no one spoke for a beat. Because he was right, and every person in that room knew it. This was a true story that ended with the specific accountability it deserved, but the reason it ended that way, the reason the impossible discovery could be retrieved and weaponized and made to matter, is because James Blanc had the institutional access to do it, the legal fluency to know what to ask for, the personal network to have a civil rights attorney file a preservation demand in 2 hours, the standing to make federal investigators take a recorded statement from a car dealership manager seriously. The man in that garage had everything he needed. The question James raised, the one that mattered, the one that sits after the settlement papers are filed and the terminations are processed and the audits are scheduled, is about the man who doesn't, the one who also had valid ID, who was also calm, who also said you're making a serious mistake in a steady voice, and who also was not believed. That man exists. He exists in multiples. His story doesn't have a preservation demand filed in 2 hours. His story doesn't have a vehicle release verification log sitting in a filing cabinet waiting to surface. His story has a complaint number that ages quietly in a system that was designed, in part, to let it. James Blanc didn't just win his case. He spent the next 2 years using his standing on the bench to quietly accelerate 3 civil rights cases involving unlawful detentions where the defendants had no institutional backing, and the body cam footage had gaps of the exact same character as Shawn Casper's. He didn't talk about it publicly. He didn't need to. The paperwork spoke loud enough. If you made it here, you already know why this story matters. Not because a powerful man was mistreated, though he was, but because this true story shows you exactly how the machine works when it thinks the outcome is already decided. We tell these stories on this channel because documentation is resistance, because the most dangerous thing a system built on selective accountability can face is a record that doesn't disappear. If that resonates, subscribe to our channel, because when the next story drops, you'll want to be here. We don't do summaries, we build cases. Hit the notification bell and share this one with someone who needs to understand why calm and documentation are not passive. They are sometimes the sharpest weapons in the room.